It is 00.12 on August 18, 1943, somewhere above the Baltic coast, and the night sky east of Peenemünde is on fire. Lancaster bombers of 5 Group are turning for home in a long, ragged stream, engines straining, gunners scanning the blackness for the silhouettes of German night fighters. Nothing comes. No tracer arcs towards them. No searchlight finds them. And yet, one after another, aircraft simply erupt. A wing catches a light without warning. A fuselage splits open in a sheet of orange. Men who were alive and flying 30 seconds earlier are now falling through 18,000 feet of darkness inside a burning machine, and nobody left in the bomber stream can say why. By the time the last aircraft crosses back over the English coast that morning, 29 of the 166 bombers dispatched in the raid's third wave will not return. Crews report flak. Crews report fighters seen from a distance. Almost nobody reports what is actually happening, because almost nobody sees it. The attacks are coming from directly underneath. From a blind spot no British bomber crew has been trained to watch, fired by guns that show no flash and leave no tracer trail. For months, Bomber Command's intelligence officers will study photographs of burned-out wreckage and debrief shaking survivors without identifying the cause. Crews will invent their own explanation rather than live with no explanation at all, and that invented explanation will spread through squadrons as established fact, repeated in messes and briefing rooms from Yorkshire to Lincolnshire. This is the story of Schräge Musik, a single mechanical idea exploited by a small number of Luftwaffe night fighter crews to devastating effect, that turned the underside of every RAF heavy bomber into a killing ground its designers had simply never imagined needed defending. It is a story about a vulnerability nobody had thought to test, a solution so simple it embarrasses every assumption that preceded it, and a deception so complete that British airmen spent the better part of a year fighting a phantom while the real threat picked them off in silence. Understanding how it worked, and how long it took anyone to realize it was happening at all, explains one of the strangest and most lethal technical surprises of the entire bombing war over Germany. By the 4th year of the war, RAF Bomber Command had built its entire night offensive around a calculated trade-off. Heavy bombers like the Lancaster and the Halifax flew with gun turrets in the nose, the dorsal position behind the cockpit, and the tail covering the rear, the top, and the sides of the aircraft with overlapping fields of fire. What they did not have, with rare and short-lived exceptions, was any gun capable of firing downward and to the rear. Designers had judged a ventral turret not worth the weight, the drag, and the additional crew member it demanded, since a fighter attacking from directly below and slightly behind would, in theory, struggle to hold a stable firing position against a moving target in total darkness. It was a reasonable engineering judgment given the technology of 1940 and 1941. It would prove catastrophically wrong by 1943. The problem facing Bomber Command was that the bombing campaign itself required higher and higher loss tolerances to remain viable at all. Air Marshal Arthur Harris's strategy depended on sending hundreds of aircraft over Germany on a single night, accepting that some percentage would not return, in exchange for inflicting damage that might shorten the war. Planners worked on the rough assumption that loss rates above 10% on a given operation were unsustainable over a full tour of 30 missions, since a crew facing 5% losses per sortie had only a modest chance of surviving to the end of their tour at all. Through 1942 and into 1943, loss rates hovered in a range that was painful but tolerable. Then, through the winter of 1943 into 1944, something changed. Raids that should have produced losses in the region of 4 or 5% began producing far worse nights, and nobody at High Wycombe could say with confidence why. The numbers told their own story even when the cause remained obscure. On the raid against Leipzig on the night of February 19, 1944, 78 of the 823 bombers dispatched failed to return, a loss rate well beyond anything the planners considered acceptable for a single operation. Barely 6 weeks later, on the night of March 30th/31st, 1944, the raid on Nuremberg produced 96 losses from 795 aircraft dispatched, the single worst night of the entire war for RAF Bomber Command. Aircrew flying these operations were not simply facing danger in the abstract. They were watching aircraft around them in the bomber stream catch fire and fall away with no warning that conventional briefings had prepared them for. Flak could account for some of it. Conventional fighter attacks pressed home from astern in the way every gunner had trained to expect could account for more. But the pattern of losses, aircraft disintegrating from within with no preceding burst of cannon fire seen by anyone aboard, did not fit either explanation cleanly, and intelligence staff were working from fragments, scorched wreckage, contradictory survivor accounts, and a steadily worsening casualty list that had to be explained to crews who flew again the following night, regardless. What made the mystery so corrosive was the human cost of getting the explanation wrong. A bomber crew told that unexplained fires were caused by flak would brief differently, fly differently, and watch the sky differently than a crew told the truth. That something below them, invisible and silent, could end their aircraft in a single burst. For the better part of a year, most of them were briefed on the wrong threat entirely, and that mistake cost lives in ways that are now impossible to fully calculate. The deception had a name, and the name itself reveals how casually the idea began. Luftwaffe night fighter crews referred to upward-firing cannon installations as schräge Musik, a colloquial German phrase roughly meaning slanted or oblique music, derived from a contemporary slang term for the kind of dissonant, syncopated jazz that conservative German tastes found jarring. The reference was sardonic. There was nothing harmonious about it. The idea itself had emerged not from a research institute or a ministry directive, but from operational improvisation within frontline night fighter units, men who had watched bombers pass directly overhead, immune to interception from any angle their own armament could reach, and asked a simple question: what if the guns pointed up instead of forward? The technical solution, once arrived at, was almost insultingly straightforward. Engineers and unit armorers fitted twin-engine night fighters, principally variants of the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and later the Junkers Ju-88G-6 and the purpose-built Heinkel HE-219, with one or two cannon mounted in the fuselage and angled to fire upward and slightly forward rather than along the aircraft's normal axis. Early installations used the 20mm MG-FF cannon. Later and more effective fits used the considerably more powerful 30mm Mk-108, a short-barreled weapon firing a shell heavy enough to cause catastrophic damage with a single, accurate burst. The guns themselves were unremarkable. What made the installation lethal was the tactic it enabled. A night fighter, guided to the general vicinity of the bomber stream by ground radar, and then onto an individual target by its own airborne radar set, would approach from behind and below, then climb gently until it was flying directly underneath its quarry, sometimes as close as 30 meters, tucked into the one cone of sky from which a Lancaster or Halifax crew had no gun that could bear, and, just as importantly, very little chance of even seeing the attacker silhouetted against the night sky above them. Once in position, the pilot had what gunnery instructors might describe, with deliberate understatement, as an extraordinarily generous target. A 4-engine bomber's wing roots and inboard fuel tank sat directly above the firing line, fully exposed, never designed to be armored against an attack from that angle because no one had anticipated that angle would ever be used. A short burst, often no more than 2 or 3 seconds of fire, was frequently enough to ignite the fuel load and bring the aircraft down. Crucially, because the cannon used little or no tracer ammunition, the attack produced almost no visual warning streaking towards the target. There was no telltale string of glowing rounds for a gunner to spot and react to. There was simply a burst of fire from below, and then the aircraft was burning. Manufacture of the installations themselves required no dedicated new factory and no exotic material. Existing cannon, drawn from the same production lines feeding conventional fighter armament, were reworked into oblique mountings by squadron-level technicians and by the manufacturers retrofitting aircraft already coming off assembly lines at plants producing the Ju-88 and the Bf-110. This was not, in other words, a wonder weapon born of a secret laboratory and unveiled with fanfare. It was a field modification, adopted piecemeal through late 1943, that by some point in 1944 had been fitted to roughly a third of all German night fighters in service, a quiet, almost bureaucratic spread of a tactic that none of the men dying beneath it had any name for. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The first confirmed operational use of Schräge music came on the night of August 17th to 18th, 1943, during the raid against the German rocket research facility at Peenemünde, codenamed Operation Hydra. A diversionary attack on Berlin by RAF Mosquitoes succeeded in drawing away much of the main German night fighter effort, meaning only the third and final wave of the Peenemünde raid encountered significant numbers of night fighters at all. That third wave, comprising 5 Group and the Royal Canadian Air Force's 6 Group, lost 29 of 166 aircraft dispatched, a loss rate close to 20% against a force that had expected something far lighter. Some of those losses came from conventional attack and flak. A meaningful share came from an entirely new method of killing that almost nobody aboard the surviving aircraft could properly describe afterward. The most documented individual exponent of the tactic was Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, a night fighter pilot whose unit, Nachtjagdgeschwader 4, operated from Gütersloh, an airfield that would later, with a certain historical irony, become an RAF base. On one notably ferocious night, Schnaufer and his radar operator used their upward-firing cannon to shoot down 7 Lancasters inside a span of just 20 minutes, between 20.43 and 21.03. On the same operation, across the wider force, 4 night fighter crews together accounted for 28 of the 62 bombers lost from 800 dispatched. Research into Schnaufer's total wartime score suggests he was credited with the destruction of aircraft carrying at least 815 Allied airmen over the course of his career, a great many of them Australian, Canadian, and British crew who had no idea, in their final moments, that the attack killing them was coming from directly beneath their own aircraft. Specific squadron accounts from this period carry a particular grim texture. Records from 49 Squadron describe an air gunner shot down on a Berlin raid in December 1943. His aircraft destroyed when cannon fire, fired upward into the fuel tanks from a position no one aboard had been watching, brought the bomber down over marshland with the loss of the entire crew. Accounts like this repeat across squadron histories throughout the winter of 1943 and into 1944, an aircraft simply catching fire, falling out of formation, exploding before any crew member could identify what had attacked them, let alone from where. Bomber Command's failure to diagnose the threat quickly was not for lack of warning signs. Reports from surviving gunners describing fighters seen stalking from below had appeared as early as 1943, but were largely discounted by an intelligence apparatus that had no existing category for an attack of that kind and therefore struggled to credit it. Worse, a counter-explanation took hold among aircrew themselves, one that proved remarkably durable precisely because it offered something a silent, invisible cannon attack could not. A story that made sense. Airmen began speaking of so-called scarecrow shells, a supposed German anti-aircraft round designed purely to simulate, through some pyrotechnic trick, the appearance of a 4-engine bomber exploding in mid-air, intended to demoralize crews watching from elsewhere in the stream. No such weapon ever existed. The scarecrow shell was a myth, generated by frightened men trying to explain a horror they could not otherwise account for, and it spread through squadrons with the same conviction normally reserved for established intelligence briefings, delaying recognition of the real cause for months. The contrast with how other air forces approached the same tactical problem is instructive. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy independently developed broadly similar upward-firing cannon installations on their own twin-engine night fighters, achieving their first confirmed successes in May 1943, narrowly ahead of the Luftwaffe's documented combat debut at Peenemünde that August. When Japanese forces later attempted to apply the same tactic against American B-29 superfortresses conducting night raids over Japan in 1944, the results were markedly poorer, largely because the B-29 operated at a higher speed and altitude than the German bombers the tactic had been refined against, denying Japanese night fighters the comparatively stable, predictable target the Lancaster and Halifax had unwittingly provided over Europe. The American response took a different shape again, because American heavy bombers like the B-17 and B-24 had been designed from the outset with a ventral ball turret, a design choice originally driven by the demands of daylight formation flying against fighter attack from any direction, including from below. This meant American bombers retained at least some capacity to engage an attacker in the blind spot that proved so lethal to their British counterparts, even though the ball turret's cramped, isolated position made it one of the least popular crew assignments in the entire bomber. The RAF's heavy bombers, built around the assumption of night operations and a different threat model, had made the opposite trade-off, and Schrager-Music exploited precisely that gap. Britain's eventual answer to the threat was not a new gun, but a new way of seeing. From 1943 onward, an increasing number of bombers were fitted with a device known as fish pond, an adaptation of the existing H-2S ground-mapping radar set that allowed it to also display nearby aircraft below and around the bomber, giving crews at least a chance of detecting a night fighter maneuvering into the lethal underneath position before it could fire. By November 1943, several hundred sorties were already being flown with fish pond-equipped aircraft, and by May 1944 the equipment had become standard across the main bomber force. Studies of loss rates from that period suggest aircraft carrying fish pond suffered losses several percentage points lower than those without it, a meaningful if incomplete improvement against a threat that detection alone could not fully neutralize, since spotting a night fighter was not the same as being able to shoot back at one positioned directly beneath the fuselage. The material effect of Schrager-Music, then, is measurable in the loss statistics of 1943 and 1944, even if the precise proportion of those losses attributable to the tactic specifically, as opposed to conventional fighter attack and flak combined, remains difficult to isolate with confidence from surviving records. What is not in doubt is the psychological effect, which arguably mattered just as much. An attack a crew can see coming, however dangerous, is an attack they can prepare for, brief against, and develop tactics to survive. An attack that strikes from an unwatched, unwatchable angle, leaving no warning and very often no survivors able to describe it afterward, corrodes confidence in an entirely different way. For the better part of a year, RAF Bomber Command's aircrew flew missions believing, in considerable part, in a threat that did not exist, while the real threat operated with something close to impunity directly beneath them. The legacy of Schrager-Music extended well beyond the war's end. Post-war air forces designing the next generation of bombers and combat aircraft absorbed the lesson thoroughly. Blind spots are not theoretical vulnerabilities. They are operational invitations, and an enemy under sufficient pressure will eventually find and exploit any sector you have failed to defend, however unlikely the angle of attack might seem on paper. The principle echoes through later developments in all-aspect aircraft armament, in the design philosophy behind comprehensive radar warning systems, and in the basic doctrine that no approach vector should ever be assumed safe simply because it has not yet been used against you. A small number of surviving Luftwaffe night fighters fitted with the original oblique cannon installations are preserved today in museum collections in Germany and Britain, including airframes displaying the characteristic mounting that, for a brief and lethal period, turned the underside of a bomber stream into the most dangerous piece of sky over wartime Germany. Return, for a moment, to that night above Peenemünde, to a Lancaster crew watching the darkness for danger that never seems to come from where they are looking. They scan astern. They scan above. Somewhere below them, close enough that 30 meters of empty air is all that separates two aircraft, a BF-11. O holds its position in total silence, its crew watching the bomber's exhaust flames and the pale shape of its fuselage against the stars, waiting for the right moment to fire. The men above have no warning system tuned to that piece of sky, no gun that can reach it, and very often no idea that it is the one direction in the entire compass of the night that they should have feared most. What Schrager-Music proved in the end was not that German engineering had produced some impossible new technology. The cannon were ordinary. The aircraft were existing types already in mass production. What it proved was that a single unexamined assumption, made years earlier by bomber designers who simply never imagined an attack from directly below, could be worth more to an adversary than almost any quantity of new hardware. It turned an absence, a gap nobody had thought to close, into one of the most effective killing methods of the entire bombing war, and it did so largely in silence, exploited by a comparatively small number of crews against an enemy who spent the better part of a year fighting the wrong explanation entirely. Hundreds of bombers fell to it. Thousands of airmen never came home because of it, and for the better part of a year, the official explanation offered to the men still flying was, quite simply, wrong. That is the real measure of what happened over Germany in the winter of 1943 and 1944.